Now you've learned about the removal of two Confederate statues that once stood in New Orleans, Louisiana. But those statues are not alone. There have been many other Confederate monuments that were taken down in recent years. Since 2015, approximately 114 Confederate monuments have been removed from public spaces. Many people argue that the United States still has a lot of work to do, that we need to remove all the Confederate monuments. But many people argue that we in the United States also need to do a lot more than simply removing statues. For example, we need to rename streets that were named after Confederate figures, and we need to rename schools if they were named after Confederates. And many people argue that we need to do even more than that. So, for example, let's talk about Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson was the third president of the United States. He lived and died long before the Civil War, but he still is a part of this conversation because he was a slave owner. Many historians have argued that Thomas Jefferson was one of the best American presidents that the U.S. ever had. He was the main author of the Declaration of Independence. He was a champion of the Enlightenment, a champion of democracy, a champion of religious freedoms. He believed in many of the values that Americans still value today. His words, "all men are created equal," were words that were used by African Americans during the Civil Rights era as they were fighting to have equal rights in the United States. Those African Americans used Thomas Jefferson's words not only to argue for what they believed in, but to show that their position was a very American one.
Therefore, we can see why Thomas Jefferson has been for a long time popular not only in his home state of Virginia, but also throughout the United States. And so it's easy to find places, streets named after him throughout the United States, as well as statues dedicated to him throughout the United States.
Here you can see a statue of Thomas Jefferson. This one is located in New York at Hofstra University. In recent years, there's been increasing criticism of Thomas Jefferson because he was a slave owner. And people say that we shouldn't honor people who own slaves. And people say that if we want to live in a society with racial equality, we shouldn't build statues of people who benefited from racial inequality. And so today, many people are saying that statues of Thomas Jefferson should be removed. And in particular, here at Hofstra University in New York, some students are arguing that the statue of Thomas Jefferson should be removed. As of today, in 2020, the statue has not yet been taken down, but we'll see what the future holds. Thomas Jefferson is an extra important figure in Virginia history. During the American War for Independence, he served as governor of Virginia. And as you know, he was the third president of the United States. But you may not know that after he retired from politics, he was the founder of the University of Virginia, which is today one of the best public universities in the United States. The University of Virginia is located in Charlottesville, Virginia. If you go there, You can also find Monticello. Monticello is the name of Thomas Jefferson's home where he lived. Now it's a popular place for tourists to go. About 500,000 visitors go to Monticello each year. And so, as you can imagine, Charlottesville is a very popular place for tourists who want to learn more about Thomas Jefferson. For many years, one of the local traditions in Charlottesville, Virginia, has been celebrating Thomas Jefferson's birthday. People have been doing this every year for many years, but just recently, Charlottesville decided to stop celebrating Thomas Jefferson's birthday, and they've replaced this tradition with a new day in which people recognize when the slaves were freed in 1865.
Of course, some people strongly support this move, other people oppose it, but this is the decision that the Charlottesville government has made.
This is a poster for the film Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind was a novel released in 1936, and then it was a hugely successful film released in 1939.
It was very popular, very successful. Everybody went to see it. It made lots of money. It was the biggest money-making movie of all time, and it held that record for a long time. And the movie won many Academy Awards, including Best Picture.
This is the actress Hattie McDaniel. She had a supporting role in the film Gone with the Wind. She won an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress, and she was the first African American, male or female, to win an Academy Award for her acting work. So this was a great achievement for her. Gone with the Wind takes place during the Civil War and during the years that followed the Civil War. And people complain about Hattie McDaniel's character not because she's a slave, but because her slave character seems to be simple-minded, not very intelligent, and people feel that the film makes it seem that maybe all African Americans are simple-minded. Maybe that the type of work that slaves did was a good fit for African Americans. And there's been a lot of criticism of the film. People feel that the film glorifies the South during the Civil War, glorifies the Confederacy, and perhaps that the film even makes the period of slavery appear to be the good old days. And so many people today are very critical of this film, but others say that despite some serious problems, the film is still a great work of artistic achievement. Here we can see an article about the Orpheum Theater in Tennessee, in Memphis, Tennessee. This movie theater had a tradition of showing Gone with the Wind every year. They did this for 34 years, but finally they decided to stop showing the film because some people in Memphis were complaining that the movie was racist and not appropriate for a public screening, and so the tradition came to an end. This is not a Confederate monument. This is the Emancipation Memorial in Washington, D.C. This memorial honors Abraham Lincoln's decision to emancipate the slaves, to end slavery in the United States. And so, at this memorial, we can see a statue of Abraham Lincoln, as well as an African American man who's being freed from slavery. I'd like you to take a look at these three views of this memorial. I'm not going to give any analysis of this memorial because I want to hear your thoughts.
Of course, other countries face similar issues as the United States regarding our history and how our history is remembered, how our history is memorialized. Other countries face questions about what should we do with these memorials or these monuments after the way that we think or feel about the past changes over time. Let's take a look at one example, one of the many examples.
Joseph Stalin was not Russian. He was a Georgian, and he was born in Gori, Georgia. And of course, he later became famous as the leader of the Soviet Union. In 1957, a few years after Joseph Stalin's death, the Soviets opened a Joseph Stalin Museum in Stalin's hometown, Gori, Georgia. The museum was built right behind Stalin's childhood home. Of course, at this time, Georgia was a part of the Soviet Union. And this museum is an example of Soviet propaganda. You can still visit the museum today, and it still looks very much like how it did in its beginning. You can see that it is Soviet propaganda. You can see that the museum glorifies Joseph Stalin. It tells you all the good things about Stalin, about his life, about his accomplishments. It tells you about his humble beginnings when he was born into a poor family in Gori. And it tells you about his life all the way through his rise to become the most powerful man in the Soviet Union. And the museum is criticized today because it doesn't try to explore Joseph Stalin in a fair way. It only focuses on the positive. It doesn't talk about anything negative related to Stalin. It doesn't provide much information about people who suffered because of Joseph Stalin or people who suffered under Soviet rule. It doesn't talk about people who died or were imprisoned or who lost their freedoms because of Soviet rule. It only focuses on the positive.
Not only throughout the world, but in Georgia in particular, people disagree about Joseph Stalin's legacy and how he should be remembered. And some people in Georgia would like to redesign this museum to educate people about all of the most negative aspects of Joseph Stalin's life and also to teach people about all the negative aspects of Soviet Union. And in more recent years, Georgia has had some conflicts with Russia. So some people in Georgia specifically want to refocus the museum's exhibits to show how historically Russia has had a negative impact on the lives of people in Georgia. But other people in Georgia have a nostalgia for communist times, and many people in Gori, Georgia are proud that humble boy from their town grew up to become one of the most famous, one of the strongest world leaders. And so there has been a lot of back and forth in Georgia. For now, the museum remains, and it hasn't changed very much, but the battle over its future continues.